All right, good morning, everybody. Thank you all for showing up this morning to officially welcome back Kelly Kroskoff as President of Basketball Business Operations for the Indiana Fever.
No one saw this coming. The Indiana Fever's own president, the woman sitting at the very pinnacle of that entire organization, finally said what everyone had been thinking but nobody dared to voice. And what came out of her mouth didn't just turn heads, it ignited the entire basketball universe. Because for the very first time, the raw, unfiltered truth about what's actually happening inside that franchise burst into the open. The politics, the mounting pressure, the locker room undercurrents, the brutal tug-of-war between selling a brand and actually building a champion, every last bit of it shattered wide open. And once you hear the complete picture, it will fundamentally reshape everything you thought you understood about Caitlin Clark's reality in Indiana. Let's rewind to where this story truly starts. Before Caitlin Clark ever laced up a pair of Fever sneakers, Indiana was arguably the most irrelevant franchise in all of professional basketball. We're talking 6 victories in 2021, 5 in 2022, and a meager 13 inches 2023. For nearly an entire decade, they were the league's running joke: no supporters, no energy, no spotlight whatsoever. The cameras had stopped pointing their way, the seats stayed empty, and the WNBA had long since moved on from whatever the Fever once represented. That was their brutal reality, a franchise that had once been proud, now reduced to a footnote nobody bothered to read. Then something happened that no one in that front office could have dreamed up, let alone scripted. The #1 overall selection in the 2024 WNBA draft walked through that door, and in a single night, the entire axis of women's basketball shifted. Caitlin Clark didn't merely transform the Fever, she rewired the whole league. Sellout crowds materialized everywhere she stepped foot. Television ratings smashed records that people thought were untouchable. Jerseys flew off shelves faster than they could be stocked. A media frenzy erupted, the likes of which women's basketball had genuinely never witnessed before. And right at the center of that explosion, the organization was forced to make a pivotal choice: ride that historic wave, or try to redirect it somewhere of their own choosing. That's the precise moment this story gets truly fascinating. Because just when the Fever desperately needed leadership at the top that fully grasped what they possessed, a once-in-a-generation talent, single-handedly redefining the ceiling of women's sports, front office made a move that left a lot of people blinking in disbelief. They installed Kelly Kroskoff as their new president of basketball and business operations. On the surface, it made complete sense. Kroskoff had constructed the Fever before, had been part of the 2012 championship-winning staff, and knew the organization from the inside out. The team unveiled her with all the expected fanfare and celebration. But from her very first press conference, something in her language planted a seed of concern that most observers casually dismissed, a warning buried in plain sight that wouldn't resurface until it was far too late to contain. Here's the moment that blew the roof off everything. July 2025. The Fever are navigating Caitlin Clark's injury absence. Clark had appeared in just 11 games at that point, worn down by a persistent groin issue that had been grinding away at her for weeks. The fan base is simmering. The team is barely clinging to the playoff bubble. The pressure is suffocating. And right in the thick of all that chaos, footage from Kroskoff's very first press conference mysteriously begins recirculating across social media. The internet had found something buried deep inside that October 2024 speech that virtually everyone had glossed right over. In that press conference, Kroskoff had looked directly into the cameras and said the quiet part at full volume. This is about the Indiana Fever. Yes, we have a foundational player in Caitlin Clark and Aaliyah Boston, and we're going to continue adding to that. But I want this team to be a leader in the country, a brand, an enduring brand, like Apple or something. 5 words. Like Apple or something. That was all it took. Within hours, the clip went completely nuclear, and the fan base detonated in a way nobody in that building was prepared for. Because what the majority of people heard in that statement wasn't a bold vision, it was a flashing red alarm. The reaction was unlike anything the Fever organization had ever encountered. Supporters weren't merely disappointed. They were furious in a manner that was coordinated, deafening, and absolutely impossible to brush aside. The Apple comparison landed like a grenade, and here's exactly why. Apple built its entire identity around one singular visionary, Steve Jobs. And the instant he was gone, the whole empire teetered on the edge of total collapse. So when Clark's supporters heard the Fever's president reach for that specific analogy, they heard something deeply unsettling embedded within it, as though the organization already viewed Clark as one ingredient in a recipe rather than the entire dish. Enduring brands lean into their visionary. One supporter fired back across social media. Apple became a global icon by making Steve Jobs both its heartbeat and its face. Another fan pulled absolutely no punches, warning that when Clark eventually decided she'd had enough of what they labeled a front office dumpster fire, the Fever would wake up and realize they had squandered the single greatest opportunity in the entire history of women's sports. The message boards, the comment sections, the reply threads, all of them flooded with the identical core message. You do not minimize the most consequential player this franchise has ever had, and you do not pivot away from building your entire world around her. The backlash wasn't background noise. It was a verdict delivered by a jury of millions. And clearly, someone inside that organization grasped just how catastrophic the damage was becoming. Because within hours of the clip going viral, Kroskoff's entire X account simply vanished, completely wiped. No statement, no explanation, just a hollow silence where a social media presence had existed just days before. Now, here's where everything gets even more layered and complex. Because while the front office was being incinerated online, the actual players suiting up alongside Caitlin Clark every single night were telling an entirely different story, a far more honest one. Lexi Hull, one of Clark's closest confidants on the team, sat down for a Glamour magazine feature and held absolutely nothing back. Hull articulated something every insider already understood, but that almost no one in a Fever uniform had been willing to state publicly. I think there is genuine jealousy directed at the Fever, purely because of the media attention and the sheer volume of supporters who have shown up for us ever since Caitlin arrived. She went even further, pulling back the curtain to reveal that opposing teams around the league had been openly holding conversations in their own locker rooms, explicitly stating, "We cannot let the Fever win." Hull's words ripped away a veil that had been covering an uncomfortable truth-building for 2 straight seasons. The Fever are no longer simply playing basketball games. Every time they take that floor, they're walking into an arena where opposing franchises have specifically targeted them not because of their win-loss record, but because of a single name on the back of one jersey. Sophie Cunningham took it even further. The player who had rapidly earned a reputation as Clark's designated enforcer on the floor, the one who made it unmistakably clear early on that taking cheap shots at her teammate came with consequences, had already stepped forward to confirm what the whole league had been muttering about in hushed tones. Cunningham revealed she had heard it even before joining Indiana, back when she was still in Phoenix, where locker room discussions about Clark were explicit and pointed. Opponents weren't simply trying to beat the Fever, they were actively trying to send a message. That relentless narrative of physically targeting Clark, of manufacturing some brutal, welcome to the W moment that never seemed to stop repeating, had been documented across the entire season. The level of physical punishment directed at Clark stood out visibly, even to completely neutral observers. And by the time her groin injury shut her down just 13 games into the season, a growing and vocal community of people were raising serious, substantive questions about whether officiating had afforded her the protection it should have. The answer, according to an ever-increasing number of close observers, was a resounding no. But that was merely the visible surface of what was churning underneath. Because while all of this unfolded in public view, the inside account of what it genuinely feels like to be Caitlin Clark's teammate was quietly beginning to emerge, and it was nothing like what her critics had so confidently predicted. The narrative her detractors had pushed hardest was a straightforward one, that Clark was a divisive presence in the locker room, that teammates harbored deep resentment toward her, that the fame and the attention were creating fractures too severe for any team to survive. Hall of Famer Cheryl Swoops had gone on a podcast in September 2024 and detonated a bombshell, claiming that significant players on the Fever were privately expressing that they no longer wanted to be there, that the environment surrounding Clark had grown into something unbearable. It traveled fast, got amplified everywhere, and embedded itself into the background noise that trailed the Fever into their second season. Except when Clark herself was confronted with it, directly appearing as a guest on an alternative March Madness broadcast hosted by Diana Taurasi and Sue Bird, she addressed it head-on, not with anger, not with defensiveness, with remarkable, almost disarming composure, essentially communicating that you learn to accept people believing they understand what unfolds behind closed doors when they simply don't. And the players who were actually sharing that locker room kept standing behind her, publicly and repeatedly. When Clark returned from injury during the 2025 playoffs, her teammates stormed the court to meet her. They crashed her post-game interviews. They showed up for her in moments that no publicist had choreographed. When the Fever captured the Commissioner's Cup, the locker room celebration was completely, unmistakably genuine players laughing together, bonding authentically, radiating a joy that no performance could replicate. Here's the truth that the media had somehow collectively failed to assemble. The Fever's story was never really about whether Caitlin Clark's teammates liked her. It was always about whether the decision-makers above them were willing to surround her with the right pieces and commit with absolute conviction to a winning vision. That is the gap that matters. Because at court level, the relationships were genuine and deep. Aaliyah Boston and Clark were genuinely close. Lexi Hull was fiercely protective. New arrivals like Sophie Cunningham arrived singing Clark's praises before a single game had been played together. Rookie Michaela Timpson spoke about Clark with the kind of authentic admiration that is physically impossible to manufacture. When Clark left heartfelt comments on Instagram after the expansion draft stripped away two of her teammates, writing, "My Aussie for life for Chloe Beebe and Cub, I love you." For Christy Wallace, the warmth in those words was unmistakably real. But chemistry and affection alone do not deliver championships. And that tension sits at the absolute core of everything. What Kelly Kroskoff actually said in that October 2024 press conference, the full, unedited version, not just the Apple soundbite, contains something that got completely swallowed in the rush to react. When Kroskoff spoke about building an enduring brand, she also referenced the long game with genuine depth. She noted that Caitlin Clark was 10 years old when Indiana captured its only title in 2012, suggesting that sometimes it demands an entire generation to climb back to the summit, that the organization was simultaneously planting seeds for a 10-year-old somewhere out there who would be ignited by what the Fever were doing in this very moment. Whether you interpret that as authentic vision or convenient deflection depends entirely on what you believe the front office's true priorities actually are. But what cannot be disputed is this. The supporters who flooded into Fever arenas beginning in 2024 did not arrive because of a brand strategy. They arrived because of a basketball player. They drove for hours. They paid prices the WNBA had never seen before. They watched games at viewership levels the league had never dared to dream of. And when Clark was absent from the floor due to injury, the interest evaporated in ways that were measurable, thoroughly documented, and openly discussed everywhere. Ticket revenue declined, television numbers retreated, and the cold, hard economic reality of what Clark meant to that franchise became impossible for anyone to deny. And yet the messaging emanating from the top of the organization kept circling back to the team, the brand, the institution, as though the single individual generating every last bit of that extraordinary attention somehow existed separately from it. Kroskoff did land one observation in that press conference that resonated with genuine truth. She said that any intelligent basketball player who studied the way Caitlin Clark operates would desperately want to play alongside her. And that turned out to be far more accurate than even she probably appreciated at the time, because the Fever's capacity to attract talent had quietly transformed into one of the most compelling storylines in the entire WNBA. Players were willingly accepting reduced salaries to come to Indiana. Veterans were restructuring their career calculus based purely on the privilege of sharing a floor with Clark. The fan base she had constructed wasn't merely packing arenas, it was manufacturing an atmosphere where players craved being part of something exponentially larger than an ordinary WNBA campaign. The Fever had become, almost in spite of themselves, one of the most coveted destinations in the entire league, not through brand strategy decks or marketing initiatives, but because of a basketball player who elevated every person around her and sold out every building she entered. Now step into 2026, and everything the Fever are carrying forward. The team lost two contributors in the WNBA expansion draft, Chloe Bi to Portland, Christy Wallace to Toronto. Clark herself endured a season that was supposed to be her defining sophomore breakthrough, and instead became an injury nightmare that confined her to just 13 regular season appearances. Yet somehow, despite all of that, she still averaged 16.5 points, 8.5 assists, and 5 rebounds in the games she did play. She still earned an all-star selection. She was still the gravitational center of the entire league, even while sitting on the sideline in street clothes. Beneath all of it, the Fever were actively constructing a $78 million performance center that Kroskoff described as the foundation for the next generation, a world-class facility that won't open its doors until 2027, engineered to serve as the kind of elite home base that draws top-tier talent for years to come. The structural pieces are present and accounted for. The question that lingers, the one that genuinely matters, is whether the decision-makers above the court fully comprehend what they are holding in their hands, and whether they will construct the right framework around it before the window quietly closes. The deeper truth, the one lurking beneath every debate about the Fever's front office decisions, every controversy surrounding Clark's teammates, every polarizing hot take about locker room friction is actually far more straightforward than all of it combined. This is a franchise that journeyed from 5 victories a season to becoming the most widely watched team in the history of women's basketball in a single calendar year. That is not a rebuilding project. That is a revolution. And revolutions are not ignited by brand strategy decks and marketing frameworks. They are ignited by once-in-a-generation players who make every single person around them more compelling, more competitive, and infinitely more worth watching. The Fever president's declaration about constructing an Apple-caliber brand detonated a firestorm because the fan base immediately recognized the peril embedded in that framing, the same peril that has hollowed out other franchises throughout sports history that made the catastrophic miscalculation of attempting to swap their superstar for a logo. The players inside that locker room understand the truth more viscerally than anyone else alive. They have played beside it. They have witnessed it up close. And what they keep communicating over and over again, in every interview, every social media post, every raw and unscripted sideline moment, is that playing alongside Caitlin Clark isn't merely different, it is a singular, irreplaceable opportunity that does not circle back around. The Indiana Fever would be extraordinarily wise to ensure that every person steering that organization feels precisely the same urgency. Because one thing is absolutely, undeniably certain: the window is open right now. The question is no longer whether the opportunity exists. The question is whether they are bold enough, clear-eyed enough, and decisive enough to actually seize it.